All right, we are recording on a cloud. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Brenna Bell. I'm the staff attorney and policy coordinator for BARC. And along with Courtney Ray, we'll be doing a kind of deep dive into what should we be expecting for the changing climate on Mount Hood National Forest. And also, what can we do to make it as least bad as possible? And if you think that that framing is a little cynical, you'll understand after we go through the material. It's not going to be a totally rosy presentation because the climate projections are not completely rosy. And I wanted to spend a minute introducing you to BARC, and then I'm going to turn it over to Courtney to walk us through our land acknowledgement practice. For those of you who might not know, BARC is about 20 years old. We've been focused on protecting and restoring Mount Hood National Forest by getting people on the ground, by using the information that we learn from there to advocate for better practices for the land and for the people who interact with the forest. We really believe that for everyone who loves the forest, and that's most of us, we all have the ability to learn tools to help shape policy and change minds and hearts around how we interact with the natural world. So we're, for many years, we've been focused more and more on climate change as it's become a bigger and bigger issue for the forest, and we understand how forests and climate are connected, and really being taking a sober approach to what that looks like in the future seems important in this moment. So that's a little bit about BARC. Also, usually when we do trainings, I like to do go-rounds where everyone introduces themselves and says why they're here. I have never found a way to make that not awkward on Zoom, but we really want to still hear from you and why you came. So if people want to take just a moment and put in the chat, anything about yourself, why you came here, what your connection to BARC is, what you're hoping to get out of this evening, that will just help Courtney and I know who's in the room.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Courtney Ray. I'm BARC's Associate Director and Brenna's coworker. I see a number of our volunteers here too, so thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to lead us, as Brenna mentioned, through a practice of land acknowledgement. If you've been at a BARC event over the past couple of months, you should have a little journal or something that you've been making entries into as part of this practice. I keep mine on note cards. So if you have that journal, or if it's nearby, please go grab it. And if this is your first BARC event, please dedicate a journal or a space in your notebook for when you're at BARC events to do this practice, and also more often than that, make it a real practice. So I'll give everyone a second to grab their notebook. And Brenna, if you could share your screen and get the statement up for us. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Make sure the waiting room is okay. So is there anyone here tonight who is never heard of the land acknowledgement concept or practice before? So I'm assuming everyone's at least aware of this. Briefly, I'll say over the past, I'd say, decade or so, I have seen a lot more acknowledgement of this sort, in that it's an acknowledgement of historical place and time and of our current social situations related to land, related to the history of the land. And what many folks are familiar with is the practice of land acknowledgement and acknowledging different communities of indigenous nations and tribal communities whose lands we are on. We want to make this a bit more tangible, especially for our audience. I would say our typical audience does not include many Native people. And so for BARC, it's very important to hold ourselves very accountable to this practice in a tangible way that will cause transformation at the individual level as well as at our organizational level. And so go ahead and grab that notebook, or even if you're taking notes in your phone, that's fine. As you see on the screen is our land acknowledgement statement. As an organization founded by white people in the settler colonial lineage, BARC is a part of the legacy of land theft and the erasure of Native authority over the lands, which are now referred to as public lands of Mount Hood National Forest. As an organization, BARC has established really influential relationships with the Forest Service over 20 years. And that is part of the same federal government, which historically facilitated the violent land theft and the colonization and displacement of indigenous people and cultures. Today, non-native Barkers, many of us, have access and privilege to this land because of the violent legacy. And so right now, BARC is working to transform the organization to take responsibility for that legacy and the unearned privileges that come with it. We are learning to practice acknowledgement, respect, and support for the Molalla, Calapooyans, Chinook and Clackamas, Chinook and Wasco, Northern Paiute people, Sahaptin-speaking people who live here and who have always lived here, and the many other Native nations who have always been a part of and cared for the lands that we are now occupying. I would like to respectfully invite any Native people who are here today to have this time to speak about this. If you are here and have something to say, please take it away. For all the non-Native people who are here tonight, I would like to ask you to take the next 2 minutes to think about this history, think about the organization who you are joining in action with tonight. Think about your own story and your own lineage, and to journal about some of your intentions that will help you to continue practicing acknowledgement in the ways that we've described just now, and in other ways that you may come up with as you dedicate yourself to learning this and internalizing it through practice, through action. We'll start 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes now. Go ahead and finish with your current thought there and set your notebook aside. And turning your attention away from yourself. We'll take another moment of silence to contemplate and dedicate respect for the history and our place in it, to express gratitude, to express apology to the Native folks who may be with us tonight across all of these lands, in our present, in our future, and in our past. Thank you, everyone, for your participation there and your communion. Keep that journal. We'll be revisiting this practice at all of BARC's virtual events, and I encourage you to reenact this in new ways as you continue your environmental work and the rest of your life here on these lands. And now we can shift back into webinar mode.
Thank you, Courtney. That's such an important practice to do. Every time it goes a little bit deeper. So now we're going to talk about climate vulnerability and how incredibly vulnerable we are. The basis for this webinar came in part because the Forest Service, in partnership with the Northwest Climate Hub of the USDA and University of Washington, has been preparing climate vulnerability assessments for national forests in the Northwest. And this is currently still a draft, and it came out last year. And when it came out, we were very excited about the prospect of engaging with the Forest Service around this information, having access to it, having public discussions about it. And indeed, for a moment, it seemed like that was going to happen. The Forest Service scheduled meetings to talk about the climate vulnerability assessment with the different collaborative groups on Mount Hood National Forest. And then something happened, and honestly, we don't know what it was. If it was an internal administrative pushback from talking about climate change openly and directly, but the Forest Service abruptly canceled the workshops about them and refused to have any more engagement with the public about the climate vulnerability assessment. So we were left on our own with it and decided that the information that it includes is really important for people to know. So this webinar is the beginning of us taking this information that's really the Forest Service's information to share, but being a voice of spreading it to the public, of digging into the document a little bit more, and then of course, because we're BARC, taking a spin into the, well, what can we do about this now that we know how bad things are going to be world? So that's what the assessment is. The goals that the adaptation partnership put out, I summarized as use science for better management. It's actually a fantastic document, and it's rare for me to say that. I read a lot of Forest Service documents that are not great. They're more like crazy doublespeak. But this one really went in with the idea that they wanted to synthesize the best available science to assess both climate change vulnerability and also the capacity of the systems to adapt to the changing climate. And then hopefully mitigate the worst, use that information to mitigate the worst of those impacts. And that goes into the better management. The idea is these assessments would then blend into the actual planning and management that the Forest Service does. And as you can see from the last slide, we're talking mostly about Mount Hood National Forest, but neglected to say this was the climate vulnerability assessment for Mount Hood, for the Willamette National Forest, and for the Columbia Gorge Scenic area. So most of what we're going to talk about applies to all three. But again, since we're BARC, we'll use shorthand of Mount Hood because that's the place that we're mostly focused. So those were the goals of the adaptation partners going into the assessment. And I'm going to start out talking about what they found for kind of two main systems, for the hydrologic systems and the vegetation systems. And then Courtney is going to pick it up, talk about wildlife, recreation, and ecosystem services. Then it'll go back to me for the how could we manage better? And then Courtney will end us up with the here are the tools to get us there. That should take us through. We also really encourage you to ask questions as we go. Whichever of us isn't talking is going to be trying to monitor the chat and keeping up with those questions. It can be a little awkward in Zoom to ask questions. If there's a time that you're really confused or we're talking too fast about something or you're missing a point, just raise your hand. We'll try, like your digital hand, because we can't see everybody. We'll do our best to get to you and ask. You don't have to hold all your questions or observations or comments to the end, even though we would like to have some free discussion then. So with that, let's just get in to what they said. The beginning part is that the climate vulnerability assessment is not a climate denier. It recognizes climate is changing. The question that it poses is, how much will it change? And it recognizes that the future temperature increases are dependent on the rate of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's two different climate futures that it takes into account. One, the better one, RCP 4.5, would have an approximately 2% Celsius increase. And scenario 2, which is honestly the one that most scientists think is more likely, has an average of 4.6 degrees Celsius increase. And that's within the next 80 years. So that is a lot of increase very rapidly. And those are the two scenarios that the CVA was looking at. I'm not going to get too in depth into the minute details between them. If you're really interested, the climate vulnerability assessment isn't that long of a read. It's totally fascinating. But the main thing they recognized is the future is still unwritten, right? We know that the climate is going to warm, but there are still absolutely things that we can do to change behavior, change management, and change systems so that it will be a little bit less bad and will stay to the lower end of that climate change trajectory. But we're going to start with talking about water because, oh my gosh, it's the kind of biggest deal out there about what's going to happen. And we need, with water, to start with rain on snow events. So if any of you have lived any length of time in the Northwest, you know that our worst floods come from rain on snow events. And that they usually take place in something called the transitional snow zone, right? So that's like the mid-elevation level of the forest where it snows, but then it's not guaranteed that it will stay cold. And so if there's a climatic warming, if there's a weather event that warms, there could be rain on that snow. And when it rains on the snow, then it melts the snow very, very rapidly. And all of that snow and all the rainwater move into the systems. And you can see what happens in the forest from one of these pictures. That's the Sandy. And then you can see what happens downstream. And this is a picture of the 1996 floods, which were an exciting time. You know, President Clinton came to downtown Portland and helped us sandbag the waterfront so the water wouldn't go over. But I don't think it's anything that we're really excited about having on a more regular schedule. But that is exactly what will happen. And when I say will, I mean will happen with climate change, because we are going to be having more rain on snow events. That is the first and primary thing that the climate vulnerability assessment talks about in terms of the changes to the hydrologic system. We're going to have an increase in the transient snow zone. It's going to spread. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about it is it says there will be no change in amount of precipitation, but there will be a lot of changes in the type of precipitation. So what now is falling as snow is going to, more often than not in the future, be falling as rain, which means increased peak flows, which means flashier systems overall. And so we're going to see a lot more rain on snow events in our future. I'm going to look at my notes because there's a couple of actual statistics I want to give you. It says that the number of winter high flow days is projected to increase by about 2.5% as higher elevation terrain becomes more susceptible to rain on snow events. So I'm not saying we're going to have a lot more 96 floods, but we're going to have a lot more pulses like that, more flashy things where there's a lot more water moving through the systems in the winter. And that has very real impacts, especially on the infrastructure and the road infrastructure in Mount Hood National Forest. There are already about 2,000 miles of roads, many of which they are not able to maintain under their current budget. And they're really in for a hammer. Again, I want to read some of this to you because it just said it so well that I didn't even think I could paraphrase for myself. The climate vulnerability assessment says, with decreasing budgets, many roads are minimally maintained and there's a backlog of deferred maintenance. Many roads and developments are in vulnerable locations subject to high flows. Developments near melting glaciers are subject to sudden outburst floods and debris flows. Midwinter flooding is expected to become more common in places where it occurs more widely. Increased peak flow makes infrastructure more vulnerable to effects ranging from minor washouts to complete loss of the road prism. So as the system becomes more and more flashy, as more water is flowing through at any given moment, because it is no longer being held up in snow and ice, but rather rapidly melting and moving through the system, that road system in Mount Hood National Forest could have more events that look like this. And that has downstream effects that are awful for sediment loads, for creeks, for salmon eggs, for all aquatic species. That magnitude of those is predicted to increase. So take home number one, more flash floods in the winter, tied to more rain on snow events. And then we get to the summer, where it's also real bad, but in a different way. So rather like I was saying, there is a lot of water held up in snow and ice, and because of that, it keeps the systems more stable. We're moving into a lot more of that melting. These pictures here, this is the same view of Mount Hood from 1984 and 2013 in August. You can see how much less glacial ice there is. And the glaciers feed a lot of our creeks, and I'll talk a little bit more about a specific example in a moment. But what we're experiencing is, just massive loss of snow and ice. And the more we lose snow and ice, the snow and ice that we have melts sooner and faster because there's a less thermal mass to keep it cold. So one of the things that the vulnerability assessment is full of excellent graphs, not many translated well into visuals to share with you, but this one I particularly liked. And it is the absolute change in snow residence time. It shows how much less time the snow is going to stay snow when it falls in the mountains. And those red areas around Mount Hood are about 80 less days of snow than we used to historically have. So not only will there be less snow falling, because more will fall as rain, but the snow that falls will stay snow less long. And this will lead to an increasing summer water deficit across the assessment area. Again, some statistics. This one totally freaked me out. The climatic water deficit, which is an indicator of drought severity, is projected to increase by 83 to 216%, depending on elevation and future temperature increases. And I want to pause because we have a question. Darlene? You got to unmute.
So the 80 days less snow, is that at the bottom end or the upper end of the range?
This is the upper end of the range of climate change, the 8.5, the most expected prediction.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. But maybe it'll be 40 days less of snow. But that's scary. It's very scary because, most of us know our summer water is absolutely dependent on snow and ice. So I want to give you a couple more visuals of what's happening to our glaciers. These are two glaciers on the north side of Mount Hood. So first there's a map of all the glaciers on Mount Hood. And then we've got the Ladd Glacier and the Kui Glacier. And you can see how much they have receded since 1901 when they first were measured. And it's a lot. And this is real bad for people downstream. And these two glaciers, particularly I wanted to highlight because of how much Hood River depends on glacial melt to keep it going. In late summer, almost 75% of the flow in these go into the middle fork of Hood River, and it's derived from glaciers and permanent snow and ice fields. 75% of the flow. And massive receding from these northern glaciers leads to much less available water in creeks at the driest time of the year, which is coincidentally the time that most of the people downstream, the irrigators, need it most for their fruit crops in Hood River. And I want to take a moment and just explain, because I learned this in preparing, why our glaciers are so susceptible to melting because of global warming. And it's because that in the Cascades, our Northwest glaciers sit at lower elevations and milder climate than many others. And they depend on a heavy snow load to sustain them. But again, since more of that snow is falling as rain, they're not getting the snow, and then small temperature changes increase the melt speed. So all of this leads to much, much less available water in the summer in the future. But it gets worse because many of the creeks and the rivers in Mount Hood are already completely allocated. in terms of surface water available for appropriation. This is a picture of 3 Mile Creek on the east side of the mountain. 3 Mile Creek is completely dewatered by the time it hits the lowlands in the summer. There is no water left because it is over allocated with the amount of water that's in it to irrigation interests. So this is already happening. It also is happening throughout the Oak Grove Fork in the Clackamas River because of water allocations to PGE for their electrical projects. So we're at a time when our creeks are already, some of them are already fully allocated, which means that every drop of surface water is already claimed to be taken out of the creeks. And then we have a future that says available summer water is going to significantly drop because we're losing our glacial ice, because we're losing our snowpack, and what we have is going to be melting sooner in the year. So that's troubling. Just saying. And it gets worse because, you know, irrigators aren't the only ones who use the water. The fate of the fisheries and the salmon habitat in Mount Hood is also looking huge impacts from reductions in water. So as this says that flow reductions of 43 to 58% are projected. And when you have a reduced flow in the summertime, that means that all the water that is there is going to warm because there's less water getting the same amount or more because of warming climate, thermal input, which means we'll have less water that's warmer, which is awful for salmon. And I want to talk just a little bit, because one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the climate vulnerability assessment is it didn't just talk about, oh, all these things are going to happen. It discussed what is the adaptive capacity of these systems. And honestly, for the water, there wasn't much. It just said, well, these things are going to be real bad. But for the bull trout and the salmon, it's slightly different than just real bad. So for the bull trout, it's real bad. They have a limited adaptive capacity because they have a very limited habitat and they are really restricted to very cold water. And bull trout have just been reintroduced into the Clackamas River area in experimental populations. And it's that water temperature that they depend on being really cold to allow them to thrive. So bull trout's adaptive capacity is very low. However, steelhead and redbound trout have a high adaptive capacity for adjusting to the potential effects of climate change due to their very plastic life histories. Plastic being a word that's used by scientists in a very different way than I usually use it, but very flexible, able to change and mold. So steelhead and redbound trout, it's not as dire. As long as there's water in the system, they should be fine given the changing climate. And coho, chinook, and chum salmon have what they call moderate adaptive capacity to respond to climate change. Because although they can be flexible, they are still very susceptible to the change in temperature and increased sediment in the water, which will also happen if there's a reduced flow. They also already have a very decreased population, which will affect their ability to adapt. So across the fisheries, you've got bull trout on the probably not going to make it side, redband trout and steelhead on the probably will do just okay. And the threatened salmon in the middle, it's much more of a question whether or not they will survive as the water flows decrease, as the water temperatures increase. So there's water. It's a doozy. This is the one that kind of got me real depressed today as I was thinking about all the systems that depend on that snow and ice. And when it's not there, what will we do? We're still going to have a lot of rain. Remember, there's no change in precipitation. It's just going to be falling very differently, which means it will not be stored in the system in the same way, which means everything gets flashier. We have more water in the summer, more water in the winter, less water in the summer, and not a lot of great options to adapt. There are a few though, and we'll get there. So if that's depressing, hold on. we've got some good news. But before I go there, I wanted to throw this in just because I thought this was really interesting, and it's something I hadn't thought about. With the decline in snow, there will be a lot more of the forest that is accessible year round. And so this is a chart that shows the projected change in number of days where snow covers National Forest Service roads. And so there's going to be a huge, or maybe not huge, but significant decrease in the number of days that roads will be impassable because of snow. And that can lead, as Courtney is going to mention, to some interesting recreation impacts and wildlife impacts. All right, now we're going to go into vegetation. So I wanted to pull up a little drought map. And this is a map that I've been using as I've been talking about fire, because the drought that we are in and have been in for the past about 10 years, give or take, a couple of years we haven't been in it, but for the past 10 years, we've been in a fairly consistent drought, shows that even in the spring, and we had a wet spring. Some of you remember March, it was wet, but by April, we were already considered to be in drought in Oregon. And the way drought interacts with vegetation and fire is something that more and more people are learning. People say, well, these big fires we have are because of climate change, right? But why? Like, how is climate change actually affecting the fire? And the simplest answer is that it is making all the vegetation really dry. It is increasing what they call the fuel aridity. And anyone who started a fire knows that you want real dry wood, right? I have definitely made some fires with wet wood, and it is not fun. It is not easy. It's hard to get them going. They take a lot of work. They take a lot of wind. You have to blow on them, tend them, coddle them, baby them. Wet wood does not want to burn, and dry wood does. And so one of the things that climate change is doing is is because we have this drought that is now year after year after year, with each successive year, the fuels are that much drier. And the fire season becomes that much longer because the fuels are no longer moistening up and retaining that moisture. So that wasn't really in the climate vulnerability assessment, but I thought that was very important that we understand more what the relationship between fire and climate change is. It's really not about the amount of fuel. It's about how moist or dry that fuel is. So when this of course seems very like a bit of a prophecy. This was written last year. But if you'll see in talking about moist forests moving forward, it says in moist forests, large, high severity wildfires may occur occasionally when fire weather and dry fuel conditions coincide, particularly during synoptic east wind events, like that hella big windstorm that we just had on Labor Day. The forest was so dry and that wind was so strong. Again, it's not about how many trees there are. You know, a lot of people say, oh, if only we logged more, if only we used more prescribed fire, if only we managed the vegetation differently, maybe it wouldn't burn. But on the west side moist forests, fuels reduction doesn't work at all. I do now a lot of work on both sides of the forest, and it's pretty different. So we're focused first on west side moist forests. They only burn under very specific conditions, such as the ones we just had. And when that happens, there's no stopping them. As long as the wind is blowing, the fires will keep going and the forest will keep burning. It will burn through grasslands, it will burn through clear cuts, it will burn through thinned forest, it burns through old growth. There were some stands of really big old trees that got burned fairly heavily in the last fires because it's a weather event. And what the climate vulnerability assessment suggests, and I think what we're seeing, is this type of weather event will become more common. Not necessarily that there will be more wind, even though that might happen because of climate change, but definitely because there will be drier fuels for longer periods of time. And so when those wind events do come, the forests will be much more susceptible to a large-scale burn. And, you know, we're still trying to figure out everything that happened in Mount Hood National Forest with the Riverside fire that just went through the Clackamas. Myself and our Forest Watch coordinator, Michael Crocta, will be putting together a what do we know about Riverside and how will it affect the forest webinar, probably for next month. But for right now, it's right on schedule with what the climate vulnerability assessment said. Our west side forests are going to see more fire as they dry out. And our subalpine forests, the ones from taking us up to the crest of the mountain on both the west side and the east side of Mount Hood, we've got these wonderful subalpine forests in the crest. And perhaps the most, I don't know, I found this sentence really upsetting. It was probably my least favorite sentence in the whole vulnerability assessment. The subalpine climate space, or the suitable climate space for subalpine forests, is not projected to disappear by the end of the century entirely. And I just was like, oh geez. So is it going to disappear entirely, you know, shortly after? Because the caveat to that sentence was, that follows is, however, upward migration of the tree line must include the successful recruitment of tree seedlings, but the mechanism is dependent on microsite facilitation and may be limited by unsuitable topographic conditions on the upslope areas, which means that even if the forests persist, the trees that are there, we might not have any baby subalpine trees coming in because the forest is changing so much that there will no longer be suitable habitat for new trees in the subalpine forests to grow. So we might be on the edge of losing an entire habitat type in Mount Hood and Willamette National Forests with the subalpine. And I just think that's real sad. So now we'll move to the good news though, for those of you who like oaks and pines. The east side forests are actually predicted to do well and spread. The main limiting factor for east side forests is precipitation. And given that we're predicted to have as much or more rain in the future, the east side forests may be growing and expanding. And even if they're not expanding, they have, you know, the paleoecological evidence, I put in that term because I thought it was so lovely, says that these east side forests typically do okay in climatic changes. And so we're not as worried about them. Their adaptive capacity is much, much higher than the subalpine forests. And they have a long history of living well with fire, and that is not predicted to change with the changing climate. So that, I think, is, yeah, that's what I've got for vegetation and water. If there aren't any questions, I'm going to kick it over to Courtney to talk about wildlife. Just pause.
Thanks,
and see
Brenna. Let's just take a beat, yeah, and see what people think. And it's also sometimes helpful to just click back to any particularly complicated slides for a second and let people take a second look.
I can go to my favorite graph, maybe.
I know there are some other like environmental professionals and students here. Would love to hear some of your insights or other reflections now that you've been presented with this. Janice has a question. Where is the demarcation of west and east?
That's a good question. You know, there's kind of west, and then there's the crest, and then there's the east. And I would say that the east starts when you start getting out of those moist, or the cold forests, really, the mountain hemlock dominated forests on the east and down into the moist mixed conifer. Then you go into moist mixed conifer on the east side, which is like, but a little unlike on the west, and then get into the drier pine and like true fir forest, and then down into the oak savannas. So it's just like right over the crest. And one of the interesting things about Mount Hood, we're the only national forest in the Cascades that has an east and west side. All the other national forests stop at the crest. And so there's one forest on the west side and one forest on the east side. But we straddle both sides, which calls for very different management on both of them, both sides. So, and if that was too ecological, I'd say geographic, pretty much everything east of Highway 35, like at least on the north side.
All right, moving on. We'll talk about wildlife. And the way that this assessment assessed impact to wildlife is very closely tied to the forest types of habitat that various wildlife are reliant on. And so everything that Brenna just described about the lower elevation forest all the way up to the alpine forest is the exact same context that they applied when they looked at the impacts to different wildlife. Some of the main challenges for wildlife is that they will need to move. They'll need to move to find temporal, or excuse me, not temporal, they're not going to go forward or backward in time. They need to find temporal, like temperature related, and all of their water needs. They need to move to find those things, but they're going to be moving around development from humans and roads. They're going to be moving around disturbances that are likely to increase, such as fire. Some species can't really move physically very well, or they need animals to help them move, other animals to help them move, such as trees and plants. And when they're reliant on very rare habitat that's already fragmented from 100 years of impact of the settler colonial variety, then they're going to be facing those initial challenges as they try to move to keep up with what's happening. This image kind of to underscore the kind of fragmentation that species will face, specifically where there's been development. There's also things that Brenna mentioned, such as drought, disease, fire, that will change the structures of the habitats at all the elevation levels. And it may take time for those structures to come back or to develop the types of structures that different species are reliant on. So they just may have, this is the temporal problem, they may not be on the same development kind of timeline as the land around them. They may have mistimed movement as they look for the conditions that they need. And in particular, aquatic and semi-aquatic species will see their habitat change the most, as Brenna described how much water will change over the next 100 years or so. So early sterile habitat is going to happen in every forest type at every elevation. The early plant community that arises first after a disturbance. And so early sterile habitat is predicted to increase across all the habitat types because of these increased disturbances like fire, floods, landslides, and the changing water cycles, or the changing water regime, will make those the maturation of some forest types more difficult to achieve. They'll be, a little bit starved for water, so the growth and maturation may be slowed down, keeping early sterile habitat more abundant, which compared to now will be considered an improvement for the species that rely on early sterile habitat. Because right now it's in a deficit due to 100 years of fire suppression and the encroachment of conifer trees into areas that would have otherwise been kept open by fire. So something to think about. This wildlife section kind of shows the good and the bad in a way that I find very compelling. Toward the lower elevations where those oak forests are now, which have been encroached upon by conifer forests over the last 100 years on the west side in particular, likely to see the oak forest moving up the slopes on the west side as well, from in between the Willamette River Valley and the low elevation, assisted by more frequent fire clearing the way for them. So this is going to be beneficial to the species that rely on oak woodlands. This deer is a white-tailed deer, which actually does not live in Mount Hood National Forest currently, but the projection that they may move up into this region from more southern parts of Oregon follows if their oak habitat is to expand. At the same time, as those oak habitats expand upward on the slopes, the moist, low elevation conifer forest will be looking upward as well for where can they be. And as the oak forest transitions into moist coniferous forest moving up, moist coniferous species will move up again into what is currently alpine or subalpine areas that may turn into habitat that typically exists in lower elevations. And then at the top, you see the alpine habitat likely disappearing, not before the end of the century, as Brenda said before. Some of the species that are impacted are federally listed, threatened and endangered species, or state listed, threatened and endangered species. Others that they studied with the assessment are surveyed for other reasons, but all species are going to be impacted. I thought it was interesting as I read this that the things like pollinator, the bee is here, the western bumblebee is here because it is an endangered species. But pollinators in general were predicted to benefit from the changing climate because of a longer growing season. And while they may miss the flowering plants, or I should say native, not all pollinators, but native pollinators would actually be challenged by missing the native flowering plants. But invasive species and other species may thrive and actually take over the niches in the ecosystem previously occupied by what we would currently describe as the native species that or have been here for the modern era of our zoological time. So they did this assessment by looking at the habitat for the species because, in their own words, the uniqueness of the relationships of all these species in their niches in the ecosystem is so complex that the available science cannot completely determine what the impacts on specific species will be. The best they can do is look at the habitat that those species rely on and see what will happen with that habitat and then extrapolate. So the wildlife section is a little bit of a lot of generalization. And this struck me in particular because I think that the concept of something being too unique for science to nail down strikes me, and particularly in the context of looking for new ways of understanding the landscape that we're in order to coexist with it, rather than having a controlling influence. Although we are reviewing a Forest Service assessment, so they are manager. Their whole thing is to be managing. I'd love to see if anyone has particular questions on any particular critters. I have the document in front of me, but for the most part, we extrapolate from what's going on with their habitat, as Brenna described. The wildlife assessment did not describe any collapse. I guess that's fortunate. It did recognize, although it didn't go into deep detail on salmon species, but as the water temperatures change, salmon species are not expected to expand. Certainly, they may be able to be preserved in certain watersheds. Everyone's habitat and everyone's niche will shrink or move. But that's the thing, that's kind of the best the assessment can say, because they don't have enough information on based on the uniqueness of these species interactions, or at least in this assessment, the Forest Service claims that they don't have the detail necessary to tell you exactly what would happen with any of the species that they name in here. So I think my takeaway from this reading this is a little bit different than Brenna's. Change is inevitable. There's adaptation built into ecological systems. Species are adaptable over time, and inevitably niches will change, and the species that have the requisite or the useful qualities will be able to take advantage of that. As we described, the oak woodlands actually expanding, the early feral landscape expanding. For the species that rely on the alpine, the old growth, and the areas that are predicted to become even more fragmented to the point of their disappearance, those particular areas would deserve, I think, the most attention in terms of intervention. Were there to be something to do to keep alpine habitat intact? But as we see all these things transitioning over the next century, there are going to be, as this assessment says, winners and losers. All right, well, we can talk recreation for a bit. This one is also, I'm going to ask for some audience participation here. So I broke down the numbers just for Mount Hood out of this assessment, which was for the Columbia Gorge, Mount Hood, and the Willamette National Forest. The vast majority of recreation visits are considered what they call warm weather activities. And so you can imagine what those are. They're the things that you can do in the spring and summer and into the fall. It includes camping, hiking, things like that. Warm weather, there are other warm weather activities that are kind of categorized in other sections, like hunting and fishing are actually in wildlife. And swimming and boating is not considered a warm weather activity, it's considered a water-based activity. The climatic changes that should impact all of these types of recreation are there on the left. And they do impact, they kind of impact each other in interesting ways. So I'd love to ask for folks to kind of mess around with this information a bit. Things like low stream flows and summer crowding may not seem, low stream flows may obviously seem an impact of climate change, but summer crowding is seems a little bit unrelated. Does anyone have an idea what they may be referring to with summer crowding? Okay, I'll just tell you, it's everybody going to the river to swim. Meanwhile, the flows are lower for all the reasons Brenna mentioned. And so the impact there is a loss of access to water-based recreation in the summer because of the low flows and because of the higher temperatures driving people to the rivers. Increased wildfire and smoke was predicted to impact all the types, especially the smoke was predicted to impact all the types of activities. Even the winter activities, like the snow-based activities, wildfire, increasing frequency of wildfire was predicted to affect their access. And usually the fires don't go up high enough, you would think, to impact snow-based recreation that much. But I took that to mean we would be seeing fires at higher elevations as well. Winter crowding, kind of for the same reason as summer crowding, as the snowpack decreases and available snow-based recreation sites decrease, those areas will become crowded with people. And because the winter overall, the season will be shorter. Another interesting point was that the shoulder seasons, those are the fall and the spring, like in between the extreme heat and the extreme cold seasons, that's called shoulder season. are likely to expand, making it into the winter, making there, be more available warm weather, nice weather for recreating in, which you would think would bring more people to the forest, but at the same time, they may be increasing fire frequency, and warm enough water tends to have algal blooms, which may tamp down the increasing recreator numbers. So again, a lot of give and take with what the impacts may be for people experiencing the forest. The gathering uses captured under recreation were predicted to benefit because of a longer growing season for many of the non-timber products that are gathered in the forest. Ecosystem services are services and benefits that people receive from nature. This is the language that the Forest Service uses, and they qualify it under these 4 categories: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and then supportive. And they are, I believe, required by a recent planning rule to consider ecosystem services in their NEPA work. The Forest Service had a lot to say about how much wood products was an important ecosystem service and would be impacted by climate change, and how there would need to be additional salvage after fire logging and thinning and fuels treatments in order to maintain the timber production part of ecosystem services. And they included this fun graphic to illustrate how much value. So if you even just look at the size of dollars, it's like timber is nothing compared to water, very little compared to recreation, very little compared to the carbon storage. Decorative plants and craft sales. Yay, question. Carbon stock. Carbon stock is the carbon that is currently in its organic form on the earth in the terrestrial form, whether it's in a plant, animal, soil, mineral carbon. They call it the stock. And I think they actually, what was it, Brenna? You had the number, 14 million, oh man, let's find it. Carbon in Mount Hood National Forest, the 6th largest carbon stock of all the national forests in the country. And they have it, they know exactly how much it is here. They priced it out as to its value, but the Forest Service persists in not considering carbon when they plan their timber sales. And it is not referenced in their forest management plan. I'm not super moved by the concept of ecosystem services, so I had a very hard time reading this section. It was thought that most of the ecosystem services would not benefit from the changing climate. Besides, timber may benefit, although with the trade-offs from a longer growing season. Although that the rate of growth of the timber may be lower due to scarcity of water as the trees mature. Okay, let's move on to solutions.
Okay. Let's move on to solutions.
Let's move on.
That's the we can do better part. It just wanted to pop in there. So there are 3 things that we want to talk about in terms of, moving forward from here. Where do we go from here? And in all the cases, the management of the national forest could be doing better in terms of climate adaptability, in terms of carbon sequestration and storage, and in terms of carbon emissions. So I'm going to look at a couple of things that the Forest Service could be doing to plan better, and then Courtney is going to talk about the way those translate into policy and how we can advocate for that change to happen. So let's start with the main thing that the climate vulnerability assessment was talking about is climate adaptability. And there's 3 main things I want to talk about. As you heard, I'm very concerned about the water and how our ability to store water higher up in the watersheds is we're just losing it with the melting of the glacial ice and the snow. So if you've been around Bark for a while, you know that we've been doing more and more work on restoring beavers to Mount Hood National Forest. And it just makes me happy that we have a huge problem of losing water from the upper reaches of our watersheds. And there's a really awesome natural, maybe not solution, but at least ally in that, in fighting that, and that's reintroducing and restoring beaver habitat in Mount Hood National Forest. So one of the first pictures, you can see a beaver dam. One of the great things about beavers is they love to store water. They just will do it. It's what they are made for. And when you have beaver in a system, it slows down the flashiness of the water moving through. Remember how I was talking about the peak flows and the low flows? One of the things that beavers do is help regulate the flow of a system. And when you get them into a system, all of a sudden the water, instead of just flashing down a river in the winter or totally drying out in the summer, gets stopped by the dam and absorbs into the ground and then slowly releases over time. So one of the great things we can do for climate adaptability is look to our allies, our natural allies, in restoring ecosystem function. And I see there's a hand there, Darlene. You got to unmute.
So how high will elevation will beavers live?
Not as high up as the snow and the ice. But you know, we're trying to get them into more of the headwater reaches. Like we've really been focused on the Clackamas drainage, so up into the upper Clackamas or the Kallawash or North Clackamas area. And you know, anywhere a beaver is helpful for this system, but just the higher it is, the more water will be moving downstream throughout the rest of the cycle.
Okay.
So as long as there is food for them, that's the main thing Bark has been working on doing, is restoring food, and that's making sure that there's enough trees like they like to eat and available building materials. They'll move into the system and they'll just keep moving in, but we have to make sure that the available food is there. So it's been exciting work, and you know, trying to look at building climate resiliency back into a system that used to have all this resiliency in it, but it's been denuded over time. I mean, beavers were one of the, you know, the first main ecosystem disasters from settler colonialism was the great extirpation of the beavers and the drying out of our forests. And so we're really advocating for management that increases the climate resiliency of the ecosystem itself. So beavers is cool. The second, thinking about wildlife, and from both the climate vulnerability assessment and other, you know, work that all wildlife biologists are doing, and saying one of the most important strategies to support species is to maintain connectivity for their movements. Right? There was a question, is this forest large enough to accommodate population migration? And I think a big question of that is, are the species able to move through the landscape? If they are, then hopefully yes. Because, you know, we're not just looking at Mount Hood, but Mount Hood is connected to the Willamette National Forest, which is connected to the Umpqua National Forest, which is connected to Rogue Siskiyou. I mean, they're all in an unbroken line in the Cascades. And if they have a hotspot to swim the Columbia, you get another line up in Washington. So there is a lot of land. The question is that land connected? Are there huge obstacles? And the biggest obstacle is roads, right? And so here in the middle is Bark's old board president, Courtney Johnson, planting trees in a road that was decommissioned and Bark worked on replanting. And that is another way that we can work to increase climate adaptability, is by getting rid of roads, by actively decommissioning them and replanting them, because there are species that create really big avoidance patterns around roads. They will not interact with them, and if they are used, even more so. So one of the ways to increase the climate resiliency for species is to decommission and replant rewild roads. And another great way to manage to build climate resiliency is stop logging the old growth trees. You know, a lot of people come to BARC thinking that old growth are protected, thinking that maybe because of the spotted owl or the Northwest Forest Plan, old growth trees are protected, but unfortunately they're not. And the Forest Service is still moving forward with timber sales that target mature and old growth trees. Not as much, but that's because there's not as many trees left. And they're still doing it. And you know, old growth trees are important for a lot of reasons. In terms of climate adaptability, they provide cool, moist microclimates that really provide habitat refugia for the animals, the creatures that need cool areas. Usually because they retain so much moisture and water, both above ground and below ground, and they provide such a big canopy cover. I mean, any of you know it who have walked into, especially a west side grove of old growth trees, the temperature just drops like 10 degrees in there. And that can be very important to provide those cool refugia. But there's another really important reason not to log old growth forests, and that's because they store immense amounts of carbon. So that's the next thing I'd like to talk about is how do we manage the forest not just for climate adaptivity or adaptability and resilience, but also to make sure that we stay on those lower ends of the temperature increase. And we, again, have an incredible natural ally in that our ecosystems here in the Pacific Northwest are some of the best for carbon storage in the whole world. And that's exciting, especially if we were to manage for it. So as you can see from this map, the top 10 carbon storing national forests are in the Northwest. The Willamette is number 1, just because it's so darn big. You know, Mount Hood is there at number 6. They're basically based on how big you are, because this ecosystem is just phenomenal at sequestering and storing carbon. Sequestering means pulling it out of the air, right? And then storing it means locking it in, keeping it in both the trees, and then a lot underground, like a third, I think, of forest carbon is stored in the soil, in the roots and the microbes, and then a lot in the trees, mostly in the trunks. So all that carbon gets pulled out and sequestered. And what's really exciting is that we are nowhere near our potential for sequestering and storing carbon. As great as these ecosystems are currently, they could be a lot more if they were managed for it. Recent studies, a lot of scientists are really taking this seriously, because we need to get carbon out of the atmosphere, right? It's not enough to just decrease emissions. We need to pull the carbon that's existing already in the atmosphere out. And so scientists have said that we have the capacity to double the carbon stores of these forests if they were managed for carbon storage. And the main thing that looks like is, as they like to say about fossil fuels, keep them in the ground. Keep the trees in the forests. Keep them there, keep the carbon in the trees, in the soil. We've heard a lot from the timber industry that wood is a great product, is a climate-friendly product because it stores carbon, but research shows that 45 to 60% of the carbon stored in trees becomes CO2 emissions as soon as the trees are logged and processed into wood products. So you're losing the vast majority of the carbon immediately. And most trees that are logged don't go into houses or furniture, things that have long-term carbon storage, but rather go into pallets and Starbucks coffee cups and things that are single use and then thrown away, and then as they decompose, that carbon is released. So in order to have a more positive climate future, we could be managing the forests to be an ally in creating that future.
Brenda, you have a related question here.
Oh, yes.
Are there any fiscal incentives to manage forests for carbon sequestration and storage?
No, absolutely none. Not yet. That is something that we're hoping. I mean, there's the great hope that the administration might change. And if it does, there's a lot of discussion about the Green New Deal and whether or not we could incentivize keeping carbon in the ground, make financial incentives around it. There's not as much talk about that on the national forest level right now. There's a lot of talk about it on private lands and whether or not people could do carbon offsets to keep people from logging by getting paid to be other people's carbon offsets. For national forests, their budget totally glorifies logging. You could see from that ecosystem services chart that Courtney has that the economic value of logging is very low compared to things like water or recreation. But the Forest Service budget currently gives the vast majority of the money from the federal government goes towards planning logging. And the targets that the Forest Service has to meet currently under the Trump administration only focus on whether or not they're doing enough logging. There are no institutional or legal incentives. That's something we're hoping to change. And Courtney will get more into that when we're talking about policy tools to make this more realistic. I just wanted to kind of show a little chart about in Oregon, the wood products industry is one of the biggest carbon dioxide emitters. So rather than managing our forests to be, major carbon stores, we're managing them, especially the industrial forests, in such a way that they become major carbon dioxide emitters. But we're hoping to change that as people realize how just dire climate change is and how we have to change everything to avoid the worst impacts. I wanted to end, I am a lawyer, so I needed to end with a little bit of law. And here we've been very science heavy, but I wanted to talk about how is the Forest Service dealing with this right now, right? There's a law called NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and it tells federal agencies that whenever they do something that's going to have a significant impact on the environment, they have to study those impacts, disclose those impacts to the public, and allow the public to comment. And it's been a very live conversation about how much does NEPA apply to climate change, right? Because it's this emerging impact. And, when NEPA was passed in the 1970s, it wasn't something that they talked about. None of the Forest Service forest plans, at least the ones that were done in the 90s, like ours, talk about climate change. So there's a question, when the Forest Service plans a timber sale, do they have to include climate change analysis in their NEPA documents? And the answer is yes, but then the second question is, well, how much? And so the court had some things to say about the quality of a NEPA analysis, basically about the quality of a hard look. You're supposed to take a hard look at the environmental impacts. It says, I love this quote, general statements about possible effects and some risk do not constitute a hard look, absent a justification regarding why more definitive information could not be presented or provided. So you have to do more than say, it might be bad, unless that's all you know. Like as Courtney was saying around wildlife, they're making guesses because they don't have the information. But around some of the other things we talked about, the Forest Service knows exactly what's going to happen, at least in this range of bad. And so they must do more than make these general statements and possible risk. About climate change in particular, the general rule right now is that a NEPA analysis must consider a project's impact on global warming in proportion to its significance. And we, of course, argue that when you're logging some of the best carbon storing forests in the world and emitting more carbon while at the same time reducing their ability to store it, that has an impact. And the Forest Service should be looking at that impact on climate change. So I'm going to end with an example that's very, very fresh for us of how the Forest Service, knowing all of this, having the climate vulnerability assessment for over a year, moved forward with analyzing the climate impacts for the zigzag timber sale, the draft decision of which just came out, I believe, last week. So this is the entire climate change section in the zigzag NEPA analysis. It says we didn't do a quantitative carbon analysis because it would not likely lead to any changes. Like if we had the information, we wouldn't do anything different. With no action, the project area would continue to sequester carbon. The action will result in some carbon emissions and some carbon sequestration, and the impacts would be negligible. So that's what they say. They don't talk about climate adaptability. They don't talk about managing for carbon storage. They don't give the amount of emissions or loss storage, even though they could. That information is out there. They don't do any of these things. Instead, they say, we don't know and we don't care. And then if you look at the climate specialist report, they say, while there are no specific projections for the project area, the situation would likely be one where the summers are drier and the snow melts earlier in the spring. This is the specialist report from the Forest Service, who had in their hands, one would hope, their climate vulnerability assessment. And I ask you to remember back to the beginning of this presentation when I gave you very specific projections about what was going to happen, how many fewer days there would be of snow, how much more dry it would be in the summer. They didn't include any of this in their planning. And not only is there the climate vulnerability assessment, but in our comments to the Forest Service, we also cited multiple other resources that they could look at. There's the Oregon State University Climate Science and Impact website, which is fantastic. There's the USDA Climate Hub, which was the partners with the Forest Service on preparing this vulnerability assessment. There are multiple resources where people are looking at very specific places, making those climate projections, and then saying, here is how you adaptively plan so that the ecosystem is more resilient to climate when you're done. The Forest Service declined to do any of that. And we will be arguing very soon in our objection that that means they're failing to take a hard look at a very well-known impact. But more than that, it is just a missed opportunity. It's absolutely a missed opportunity to take seriously the fact that the management of the past is not going, it didn't do well for us then, frankly, and it is not going to serve us as we move forward into a much more unstable climate future. So I think I'm going to kick it back to Courtney to tell us how to get those management policies in place.
All right. Well, that was a lot. Brenda, can you go back to your slide of all the forests, slide 27? Okay. Yep, that's the one. Oh, you went too far. My screen might be behind. Okay, so these forests and a couple of Northern California forests are all under the jurisdiction of the Northwest Forest Plan. We haven't talked about the Northwest Forest Plan, I don't think, at all so far. Hopefully for folks that rings a bell. If you've been in the Pacific Northwest for about 20 or 30 years, hopefully it's ringing a bell. The Northwest Forest Plan is really a one-of-a-kind of forest management because it has a really big region that it covers. It's not just about one specific forest. It's about a particular type of habitat, and that is the habitat of the northern spotted owl. These are all the places that then include. And since 1994, the Northwest Forest Plan has been the closest to I would say, like ecosystem design and ecosystem management based on the functionality of an ecosystem, rather than strictly the production of the various services that a forest might provide for people. And the Northwest Forest Plan is in the middle of a revisioning process. It's a slow-moving process. They put a bunch of science together, which has a lot of gaps in it, as much Forest Service science tends to do. But it does offer a really important opportunity, especially since these forests of the Pacific Northwest have such an incredible carbon capacity, to utilize this regional plan to lift carbon management and climate smart management on public lands on national forests. Can you get the very last slide again so I can show people some website? So if you are on BARC's list or many other forests and environmental groups based in the Pacific Northwest in general, you may have been hearing a little bit about this for the last 5 years or so. Will you click on the first link, Northwest Forest Plan? There have been a couple of opportunities for the public to weigh in on the different analyses that they're putting together. This is a Forest Service website where you can view their bioregional assessment and the science synthesis and all these very verbose documents that they use to gather up all the information as they go into the revision process. We're anticipating that sometime in the next couple of years, they'll start to get to the point in the process where the public will be able to see the draft of the new Northwest Forest Plan. We'll be able to question whether it has accounted for climate change in a significant way, especially given its scope of millions and millions of acres. I'd say it's at least 10 million acres, probably more. And keeping track of this process is one way for folks to make sure that we are implementing climate smart, carbon centered management policies, whether it's protecting the old growth, that should be one of them for sure, reducing the commercial harvest, removing the roads, allowing for habitat connectivity for these species that will be, struggling to keep up with the geographic movement of their habitat. All of those things can be applied across the whole region if they make it into the Northwest Forest Plan. So that's a big one. I can send out these links. The next kind of management tool we have is the Mount Hood Forest Plan. So that's us right there, number 6 on the maps, Mount Hood National Forest. Each of these national forests has their own local plan. So everything that our Forest Service on Mount Hood is doing is dictated by the way that plan lays out the goals, the strategies, and the desired future conditions for Mount Hood National Forest are already defined. They were written in 1990. That's when they decided what the desired future conditions for every inch of the forest should be. And they continue to utilize that plan from 1990 in their decision-making today, which is part of the reason they're able to skirt that climate question and that carbon question the way that Brenna just threw up that example from the zigzag timber sale. They don't have clear direction or any direction in their current forest plan to monitor carbon, to restore carbon stocks or increase carbon stocks. They don't have direction in that management plan to assist species adapting to climate. Those are all things that we know that they know through their research, but they don't actually have instructions to implement that research. So BARC has been engaging with this exact same forest plan the whole time that BARC has existed, and we have seen the results. Every timber sale that we've ever opposed has been the result of the management strategies and priorities that plan from 1990 have. Our campaign to update Mount Hood's outdated management plan is called Free Mount Hood. It is live. We're online. We have a campaign committee. We would love to have you involved. The idea is that while the Forest Service should be updating their management plan every 15 years or so, they have not updated it ever once. They've made a number of amendments. Some of them are good. For example, they corral the off-highway vehicle use into specific areas that are designated for that. So they had to amend their forest plan to create these new areas for specific use. That was helpful so that the impact of that activity is ideally manageable and it's not just widespread. But overall, they have not updated their forest plan, and its major gaps are not even mentioning climate change, really not having strong management strategies for watersheds outside of the Bull Run for municipal drinking water resources besides the Bull Run. The Bull Run's in there for Portland, but nobody else's municipal water is anywhere near as protectively managed. And it doesn't address the cost to our climate future of continuing a timber program while the forest could be doing so much sequestration for us. So our goal here is to have the Forest Service, at minimum, do some amendments, including climate change, drinking water, and acknowledging the economic value of recreation and cultural values that can be the economic key to the forest rather than the extraction of the timber. And this website is a good portal to get involved. On the Take Action page, there's a number of different things, and you can also join the campaign committee, which meets the fourth Wednesday of each month. We will be holding more virtual spaces for this. We had intended to be out in the street, which we can't do. So we're definitely looking for partnerships with folks who have good virtual spaces that can reach out to many, many people the way you might be able to at a farmer's market or a public event or just on the street wandering around with, the general public. And then there's one more tool we can focus on now, which is Congress. And this is only one example of ways we can be influencing Congress. There's too many. We shouldn't even start going into them all right now. But I'll throw a couple out just to wet your whistle. Number one, the Forest Service has timber quotas. There's a congressionally designated number of board feet that they are supposed to produce annually. And that's why they continue to plant timber sales, is to meet that quota. So if we can get our Congress folks to change that top-down quota system, that would be ideal. Also, many of the other parts of the Forest Service's job description are simply underfunded. The road decommissioning world, the recreation world, the kinds of things that most people expect from the Forest Service, that interpretive learning, nature learning, forest ranger program, that all of those things are barely funded at all compared to the way the timber sale program is funded. So those two things in particular, and those both have to do with money, and we actually do have Congress folks on the appropriation committee from Oregon. So there's a lot to be said about how we can push on those folks. There's a coalition of organizations working to get our congressional delegation to put forward new legislation specifically for Mount Hood and the Columbia River Gorge to kind of take it as the next step in conservation. It is both recreation and conservation that we're hoping to make an effort toward here. All right. Oh, I see questions. Okay. Yeah. For example, zero money for wilderness trail maintenance in the budget. As we're speaking about Fremont Hood, we don't actually have a congressional buddy on Fremont Hood yet, but we will. Representative Blumenauer and Senator Wyden are two folks who have forwarded really protective legislation for Mount Hood in the past, and I believe it was last year they had a couple of really big summits. They're very excited and enthusiastic about bringing a new bill related to Mount Hood to our area, and so I'm distracted because I'm trying to email Brenda the link so she can show you. So those, we're waiting actually now to see what they'll come up with. There's some national coalitions working to get not just our Pacific Northwest delegation, but there's national forests all over the country, and so really everyone in Congress is going to be either looking at the forest as in that ecosystem services way, like how do we extract and how do we monetize as much of this as possible. In the Southeast, in Georgia and the Carolinas, you have those national forests are typically chopped up and turned into wood pellets and then sold in Europe. That's the main timber program for the Southeast. Out here, we have logs on logs on logs and dimensional lumber. The forests in the Rocky Mountains and places like that. I thought it very interesting, Brenna, that you mentioned that one of the reasons our glaciers aren't as sturdy is because they're lower elevation glaciers generally. But we have higher elevation national forests, and those forests, I would assume, also don't have climate considerations in their forest plans. So locally, your federal representatives are going to be able to impact the forest plan nearest you, the Northwest Forest Plan, and those congressional budget items that enable the Forest Service to take on certain kinds of work and not take on other kinds of work. Were you able to show us our?
No, I'm sorry, Courtney. It also went to that error screen. But can I pump in with another policy issue that we're excited about?
Yes, please.
That is the potential of an executive order that could be really useful. When Obama was in office, he directed the Council for Environmental Quality, who oversees NEPA, to tell the Forest Service that they needed to look at the climate change impacts two ways on all of their projects. One were the impacts of a changing climate on the forests and on the project, and two were the impacts of the project on the carbon cycle and climate change. And one of the first things that Trump did within his first 100 days was use an executive order to revoke that CEQ directive. And many of us are hoping that, again, if there's a new administration, one of the things that it could do is re-invoke that directive through also an executive order. It would be awesome to get that back on the books and have the Forest Service know that it needed to be looking at the impacts of its actions on climate change and the impacts of climate change on its actions.
So if you are representing an organization in Oregon or related to one in any way, you want to share with them this new recreation conservation vision for Mount Hood and the Gorge. It's the very last slide now.
Okay.
There's a number of businesses and organizations kind of signed on to support these are the features of legislation that we want here. Expanding the Mount Hood National Recreation Area to promote sustainable recreation and ecosystem protection. Coming in a second. Protecting wilderness areas. Safeguarding the wild and scenic river. Banning clear cutting and post-fire logging, which following the Riverside fire, we're going to have a lot of post-fire logging proposals. And then in the Gorge in particular, to get some funding to make sure that the recreation economy is well supported and the infrastructure is well supported. And then last but not least, managing the transportation system on Mount Hood to deal with the growing recreation demand and greater access as the climate changes. We're having too many.
Is having tech difficulties. It just doesn't want to be shown.
That's all right. I don't think I can do it from my phone, unfortunately. But we can send out.
Y'all just have to stay in touch with us
poster.
so we can show you this elusive slide.
Yeah. So we have about 15 minutes for discussion. I would love it if there's folks want to turn their cameras back on. Oh, these are the ideas for. Well, the Fremont Hood campaign. So yeah, there's a couple different levels of things going on right now. The Fremont Hood campaign is BARC's campaign. The new conservation vision is a coalition of organizations that have put that together. And the Northwest Forest Plan is the Forest Service job to do. we're just going to make sure that they do it properly. A lot of the tools or the ideal management that we've described, the policies that we would like to see can be applied, should be applied throughout all of these. When we're talking about national forests, when we're talking about state and private forests, we might have very similar goals around protecting carbon and protecting drinking water and supporting a recreation industry rather than an extraction industry. The Free Mount Hood campaign in particular is focused on Mount Hood National Forest Management Plan, getting climate, recreation, drinking water in there.
And fire.
Darlene? And fire. Darlene, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so I can see from what you have presented on this vulnerability assessment why it was shut down, given the current administration's view of climate change. It didn't really want to publicize that. But I think that this is something that if we have a new administration who is really committed to addressing climate change, we can really ask that this be disseminated to the public and so forth once we have that change.
Absolutely. And, honestly, the Forest Service is, or I'd say the Northwest Climate Hub is moving forward on doing a public presentation on their next round of climate vulnerability assessments for the Siuslaw and Coast Range forests publicly. And they just announced that a couple weeks ago. So I was pretty surprised. I thought that given where the Mount Hood and Willamette one ended up, they were just not going to do any public presentations, but somehow they slipped this one in. And so if people want to hear, I think it's going to be interesting. There's Forest Service researchers from all over the West who are going to be presenting on climate impacts, and it might have a lot of overlap with what we've said, but without the translation that we did. I try and translate the scientific talk, but that one for the Siuslaw is coming up in just a couple weeks. Courtney, do you want to put that in the—
It's on October 23rd. I can't put it in the chat because I'm using my phone for but I can email you the link real quick because I just pulled it up and you can put it in the chat.
Great, we'll put it in the chat if people are interested in what the Forest Service is presenting. And again, I have no idea exactly why they pulled this, but for that it's so honest about the impacts of climate change.
So one of the other things is you were talking about things in terms of like decommissioning roads that are not needed in the forest and restoring those. Mm-hmm. That seems like a really good green forest job thing that we can promote.
Absolutely. It is. There's a lot of work to be done there. And not only that, it's the kind of work that a lot of people are wanting to support in the forest. Like BARC worked with contractors from Estacada who actually built a road 30 years ago. We helped them get funding to pull it out. And so it's like high skilled, well-paying in-forest jobs, and it's deeply needed. There used to be more congressional money for what's called the Legacy Roads and Trails program, where Congress would fund the Forest Service to decommission roads. But again, given the budget these days, that has not been getting funded. But I think it would be a great part of the Green New Deal to have active restoration by getting rid of roads. Are there any other questions, observations, or thoughts moving forward? Eileen or Elianne?
Elianne, yeah.
Elianne.
So one of the things about relying on executive orders is when you get a change of executives that they go away. And so if things go the way they should this November, and if we get both a friendly Congress and a friendly president, are there any plans for making some of this legislation like with the NAPA thing to have that legislation so it's less likely to change with a change in Congress or administration?
I think there's a lot of hope being put in a Green New Deal right now that some of that would be in it, like trying to get forests in there in a positive way in terms of carbon accounting, in terms of restoration job creation that would actually be part of a congressional package. There's also currently one of the things we're working on, it's slightly different, but it's federal legislation, is around the response to wildfires and the congressional response. A lot of people for many years have been like, we need to fix these fires. And honestly, their main approach is increasing vegetation management. Some of it's just increasing logging. They're like, if there were fewer trees, there would be fewer fires. And so there is a congressional bill right now sponsored by Representative Daines from Montana and Senator Daines and Senator Feinstein, that would increase logging as a way to do fuels reduction for fire, which we're totally opposing. And happily, there's a really good bill from Senator Harris that the Senator Wyden just said he would co-sponsor, that would just focus on homes and communities. That doesn't get entirely into what we were just talking about, but it does show that there's a little bit of a shift in Congress away from logging as the solution to all the environmental problems, which is kind of where they've been going for the past while, about a good 10 years. With their buddies in the timber industry, kind of reframing logging as this restoration solution. It's hard. Executive orders are they're easier to do, right? They're fast, and that's the benefit. The legislation is a lot slower, and no one is proposing to redo like the big daddy environmental laws right now. But I think we're really looking to try and get fire legislation that's good, and then try and get a Green New Deal that really addresses carbon accounting and managing for carbon in the forests.
Right.
So we're hopeful that we're not just like playing defense even more crazy than we already are.
Yeah.
Are there any other thoughts or questions? We're about to wrap up. Courtney and I both really like talking about this, and if you are like, wow, I want to get even more geeky about it, we've got volunteer committees that do work, Fremont Hood Campaign, like Courtney said, and then also if you want to get more on the defensive side and out in the forest, we have a lot of folk who go out and do active ground truthing. Mia, who's on the call, is one of our grand ground truthers and likes to get out in the woods and see what's up there, and then translate that into comments and advocacy for better management. We're now back in the forest finally after many breaks from both coronavirus and the fires. Part of the forest is still closed, but the part that's open, barkers are already back in checking things out. So do stay in touch. And if there were things in this that you want more follow-up on, just let us know. We're available and happy to talk about this for probably longer than you want to. Is there anything else? Sorry for the tech difficulties. Okay, y'all rock.
I'll try to put a couple things in the chat with my thumbs here now that I can, pick up my phone and treat it like a phone instead of a computer. Folks want to hang out for a second while I cut and paste and type things with my thumbs. You'll have those links for you. I'll have those links for you here shortly.